There are places on Earth where geography itself feels intentional, as if the land was shaped to force a decision, a narrowing, a pause, a moment where movement must slow and choice becomes unavoidable. Between the Caucasus Mountains and the Caspian Sea, the world tightens into such a place. Here, mountains descend toward water, and the distance between them shrinks until there is only a thin corridor, left barely wide enough for armies, caravans, or ideas to pass through without resistance. In this narrow strip of land, stone reaches. At first glance, it looks like any ancient fortification, weathered blocks, uneven lines, walls scarred by centuries of wind and salt. But as the eye follows the structure, something unsettling becomes clear. The wall does not simply surround a city, it cuts across the landscape itself. From the mountains, it marshes down toward the sea, sealing the gap as if the builders were less concerned with protecting a settlement and more intent on closing a door. Some believe this was exactly the point. Legends say that long before empires learned to name their borders, this place was known as a threshold, not between nations, but between worlds. Beyond it lay chaos lands of endless steppe, roaming tribes, and forces that did not recognize order or law. To those who lived south of the mountains, this corridor was not just a route of invasion. It was an opening through which the end of everything might arrive. In religious traditions that emerged centuries apart and continents away, the same story appears with unsettling consistency. There are beings sometimes described as nations, sometimes as monsters sealed away behind a great barrier. When that barrier falls, the world will enter its final age. Names change across cultures, but the fear remains the same. These are not enemies to be negotiated with. They are forces to be contained. Some believe the wall here was built for them. According to medieval accounts, Alexander the Great himself came to this narrow passage. At the edge of the known world, he encountered people so destructive that they could not be ruled, only restrained. Using iron and fire, the story goes, Alexander sealed them behind a massive barrier between two mountains. The wall would hold until the appointed time, when it would finally break, and history would end in fire and judgment. Modern historians will tell you Alexander never came this far. The wall, they say, was built much later. By an empire more concerned with cavalry raids than cosmic prophecy. Stone replaced legend. Dates replaced dreams. And yet, the legend refuses to disappear. Because the wall is real. It still stands. And it stands exactly where the stories say it should. This corridor was one of the most dangerous choke points in the ancient world. For thousands of years, nomadic horsemen moved across the Eurasian steppe, following grasslands that stretched from Mongolia to Eastern Europe. When they surged south, this narrow gap between mountain and sea was one of the few routes available to them. Whoever controlled it could decide the fate of entire civilizations. Empires understood this instinctively. To leave the passage open was to invite annihilation. To seal it was to claim mastery over the boundary between stability and collapse. So stone was stacked upon stone. Walls were raised not just around cities, but across the land itself. Towers watched the plains. Gates narrowed the flow of movement to a trickle. From above, a citadel surveyed everything sea to mountain, past to horizon. It was engineering on a monumental scale, but it was also something else, because the wall did more than stop people. It shaped imagination. To those living south of it, the barrier became proof that chaos could be contained. That the world, however fragile, could be defended. To those beyond it, the wall was a challenge, a symbol of exclusion, a declaration that they did not belong to the ordered world on the other side. Over time, myth and masonry merged. The wall was no longer just a defense against raids. It became a defense against ideas, against the terrifying possibility that civilization itself was temporary. In Arabic, the city here came to be known as the Gate of Gates. Not a single door, but the ultimate passage. The place where all movement was measured, taxed, watched, and judged. A frontier not just of empire, but of meaning. Stories grew around it like ivy. The tribes beyond the wall were no longer simply nomads. They became embodiments of destruction figures, onto which every fear could be projected. When invaders came, they were called by ancient names. When they were repelled, it was said the prophecy had been delayed, and the wall earned its reputation. Wave after wave of invaders pressed against it across centuries. Some broke through. Many did not. Even when breached, the barrier slowed armies long enough for defenders to prepare, for cities further south to brace themselves. The wall did not make civilization invincible, but it bought time. Time is the most precious resource in history. Empires paid for that time with gold, with soldiers, with constant repair. They understood that the cost of maintaining the wall was far less than the cost of letting it fail. In this sense, the structure functioned exactly as the legends described. It held back not just enemies, but the collapse that would follow if those enemies arrived unchecked. Standing before it today, the distinction between myth and history feels less important than it once did. Whether or not Alexander ever touched these stones almost becomes irrelevant. The wall fulfilled the role assigned to it by legend. It marked a boundary humanity desperately needed to believe in. Because walls like this are never built only for those outside. They are built for those within. They reassure, they define. They whisper that the world has edges, and that beyond those edges lies something different, something that does not belong. In doing so, they create a sense of order, strong enough to endure centuries. But even the strongest boundaries raise an uncomfortable question. If a wall is meant to keep something out, why does it feel, sometimes, as though it is also keeping something in? And if this wall truly stood between civilization and chaos, then what happens when the fear it was built upon begins to fade? Or worse, what happens when it doesn't? Over time, the wall at the narrow passage did something few structures ever managed to do. It absorbed the fears of those who lived beside it, and reflected them back as certainty. Stone by stone, it became less a fortification and more a promise that, no matter how violent the world beyond might be, it would break itself against this line before reaching what lay behind. Some believe this is why the legends hardened so easily around it. Long before scholars argued dates and dynasties, stories circulated of monstrous nations sealed away behind iron and fire. They were described in exaggerated forms, devourers of flesh, beings without mercy, forces that multiplied endlessly, once unleashed. Their purpose in the stories was clear. They were not meant to be understood. They were meant to be feared. And fear, when given a shape, demands a boundary. The wall provided one. As centuries passed, travelers wrote about it not just as a military installation, but as a cosmic divider. A place where the ordered world stopped and something darker began. Medieval writers did not distinguish carefully between geography and prophecy. To them, the coincidence was too precise to ignore. A narrow gap between mountains and sea. A colossal wall, sealing it. An ancient text speaking of a barrier built at the edge of the known world. The conclusion seemed obvious. But history, as it often does, offers a quieter explanation. The wall was expanded and reinforced under a Persian Empire that understood logistics better than legends. Engineers measured distances, calculated heights, and laid foundations with brutal efficiency. Twin stone walls stretched for kilometers, linking mountain to shoreline. Towers rose at regular intervals. Gates funneled movement into points that could be controlled, taxed, or denied. From above, the system resembled a clenched fist. At its heart stood a citadel overlooking everything below, a reminder that whoever controlled this place controlled the rhythm of movement between continents. Armies did not simply pass through here. They were delayed, inspected, and weakened. The wall did not make invasion impossible. It made it costly. And cost, in the ancient world, often meant failure. Nomadic groups from the steppe tested the defenses again and again. Some arrived as raiders, others as conquerors. Names changed: Huns, Turks, Mongols, but the experience for those behind the wall was always the same. Dust on the horizon. The sound of hooves. The knowledge that if the wall failed, there would be nothing between the invaders and the heartlands beyond. When attacks were repelled, the wall's reputation grew. When breaches occurred, the delay it caused still saved lives. Each generation inherited not only the structure, but the belief that it stood between survival and extinction. In this way, myth did not replace history. It amplified it. The idea that the wall held back apocalyptic forces became a metaphor for what it already did in reality. The tribes beyond were not supernatural, but their arrival often felt like the end of the world to those they overwhelmed. Cities burned. Populations vanished. Borders collapsed overnight. To call such events apocalyptic was not exaggeration. It was lived experience. So the wall absorbed that language. It became easier to say it restrained monsters than to accept how fragile civilization truly was. By externalizing fear, by naming it, sealing it, and pointing to it beyond the wall, societies could believe their own order was permanent. Even great powers treated the barrier with reverence. Empires to the south paid tribute to maintain it. Understanding that the cost of upkeep was far less than the cost of chaos, soldiers were stationed there for lifetimes, living in harsh conditions, knowing their purpose was not glory, but delay. Delay was enough. What makes this wall unusual is not simply its size or age, but how effectively it blurred categories. It was at once a military installation, a political border, a psychological reassurance, and a religious symbol. Few structures carry that many meanings simultaneously. And when meanings stack upon each other, they become difficult to dismantle. Even when scholars eventually concluded that Alexander himself had nothing to do with the construction, the legend remained intact. The name clung to the stones because it served a function. It connected the present to a heroic past, and the physical to the prophetic. Perhaps that is why the question of authorship feels secondary. Because whether built by conquerors or engineers, the wall succeeded in the role assigned to it by human imagination. It convinced generations that chaos could be confined, that history had safeguards, and that the end of the world would not come quietly through an unguarded gate. But walls that protect also define. They teach those within where safety ends and danger begins. Over time, that boundary hardens into identity. Civilization becomes what lies on one side of the stone, and everything else becomes other. And that division carries a hidden cost. Because once a wall is believed to separate order from chaos, anything beyond it becomes easier to fear, easier to dehumanize, and easier to misunderstand. The wall does not just stop movement, it stops empathy. Which raises a troubling thought. If the greatest strength of this wall was never its stone, but the fear it organized, what happens when fear shifts? When the threats change shape? When chaos no longer arrives on horseback from the steppe, but emerges quietly from within? Perhaps that is why stories of sealed gates and imprisoned forces persist. Not because the walls still stand, but because the need for them never disappeared. And somewhere along this ancient boundary, stone and story fused so completely that even now, it is impossible to tell where one ends and the other begins. Not all walls were built to stop armies. Some were raised for enemies no one could see. Far from the windswept corridor between mountains and sea, another kind of boundary took shape, one that did not guard cities, choke trade routes, or delay invasions. These walls stood quietly at entrances, sometimes just a few steps beyond a doorway, sometimes just inside it. They did not stretch across landscapes. They did not block roads. And yet, in the minds of those who built them, they were just as necessary. In ancient China, the greatest threats were not always believed to come from beyond the horizon. Many came from much closer, slipping through open gates, following straight paths, moving silently into homes and palaces. These forces were not invaders in the human sense. They were spirits, unseen, formless, and indifferent to walls meant for flesh and bone. Legends say that spirits move in straight lines. If true, then the solution was simple. Break the line. A wall placed directly in front of a gate would do exactly that. It would not need to be tall enough to stop a person, or thick enough to resist a siege. It only needed to interrupt a path, to force a turn, to bend movement into something less direct, less dangerous. And so, across centuries, screen walls appeared. They were built where no military engineer would ever place a defense standing alone, disconnected, facing nothing. To an outsider, they could seem decorative, even pointless. But to those who lived with them, their purpose was clear. They were filters between worlds, between the visible and the invisible, between intention and accident. Some believe these walls were the architectural expression of a deeper fear that not all threats announce themselves, and not all dangers can be confronted directly. Some must be deflected, others confused, still others quietly turned away. Unlike the massive fortifications of borders and empires, these walls worked through symbolism rather than force. They did not resist, they redirected. In doing so, they reflected a different understanding of order, one rooted not in domination, but in alignment. The placement of these walls followed strict rules. Outside certain gates, they were positioned so that arriving energies would be turned back before entering. Inside others, they ensured that whatever wealth or power lay within remained unseen. Visibility itself was treated as a risk. To be seen too clearly was to invite imbalance. This belief shaped not only architecture, but behavior. Gates were no longer just openings. They were moments of transition. Thresholds where care was required, where unseen consequences might follow careless movement. Over time, the walls grew larger, more elaborate. Dragons, clouds, and cosmic symbols appeared on their surfaces. They became canvases for entire worldviews, hierarchies of heaven and earth, rendered in glazed tile and stone relief. What began as a simple interruption became a statement. Some believe this evolution reveals something essential about how humans relate to the unknown. When a threat cannot be measured, it must be given form. When it cannot be fought, it must be revised. And when it cannot be eliminated, it must be kept at a distance, however symbolic that distance may be. These walls did not claim to destroy evil. They claimed only to prevent its entry. That distinction matters, because it suggests an acceptance of limits, an understanding that not everything hostile can be conquered. Some things must simply be acknowledged and avoided. In this way, the walls functioned as agreements, rather than weapons-silent negotiations between the human world and whatever lay beyond it. Unlike the colossal barriers of frontier regions, these structures did not inspire legends of apocalypse or conquest. They inspired habits, daily gestures, small acts of respect, toward forces that could not be named. And yet, the psychological effect may have been just as powerful. To live behind such a wall was to believe that order could be preserved through attention rather than aggression. That chaos did not always arrive violently. Sometimes it drifted in quietly, following a straight path through an unguarded door. By placing a wall where it seemed least necessary, ancient builders were making a statement. Danger does not always come from where we expect, and protection does not always look like strength. In this sense, these walls were less about exclusion and more about awareness. They trained the eye to notice thresholds, to pause, to recognize that crossing from one space to another carries weight, even when nothing appears to change. And perhaps this is why such walls endured. They required no armies, no maintenance against siege, only belief. But belief, once embedded into daily life, can be as enduring as stone, which raises an unsettling possibility. If walls like these were meant to block what moves unseen, then what happens when belief fades? When the spirits are no longer feared? When the unseen is dismissed rather than respected? Do the walls still work? Or were they always less about what they kept out and more about how they taught people to live with the unknown? Over time, some walls stopped pretending to be invisible. What began as quiet barriers meant to redirect unseen forces slowly transformed into something far more deliberate. They grew taller, wider, more ornate, their surfaces filled with color and motion, with symbols that demanded attention rather than avoiding it. These walls still blocked paths, but now they also told stories, and in doing so, they revealed something else entirely. In northern China, one such wall rose to a scale that quietly unsettled even those who ordered its construction. It stood alone, detached from any defensive system, positioned not to stop enemies or spirits in the traditional sense, but to dominate the space before a gate. Its size was disproportionate, its decoration extravagant, and its message unmistakable. This was not a wall meant to hide. This was a wall meant to be seen. Dragons coiled across its surface, their bodies twisting through clouds and waves. Colors glimmered and glazed till imperial yellow, deep green, dark purple, each chosen with intention. Every scale, every claw, every curve followed strict symbolic rules. Nothing was random. Nothing was merely decorative. In the worldview that shaped this wall, symbols were not representations. They were active forces. Dragons were not mythical creatures in the modern sense. They were cosmic regulators, beings associated with reign, authority, balance, and the mandate of heaven itself. To place them on a wall was not to display art. It was to declare alignment with the structure of the universe. Some believe this is where the function of the wall quietly shifted. It no longer existed primarily to block spirits or deflect unseen energies. It existed to project order outward, to announce hierarchy before anyone even reached the gate, to remind every visitor, consciously or not, of their position within a larger cosmic system. The wall stood between the viewer and whatever lay beyond it, but unlike earlier screen walls, it did not erase curiosity. It replaced it with awe. To stand before it was to be confronted not with absence, but with overwhelming presence. The gate behind it became secondary. The wall itself became the focal point. The threshold transformed into a stage. This inversion is telling. Walls that hide suggest insecurity. Walls that display suggest confidence, or at least the appearance of it. By making the barrier more prominent than the entrance it guarded, the builders were asserting control, not only over space, but over perception. They decided what could be seen and what would be obscured. In doing so, they shaped the emotional experience of approach itself. Approach becomes submission. Some believe this was the true purpose all along, that the wall functioned as a psychological filter, ensuring that anyone who passed beyond it did so already primed to accept authority. The imagery did the work before a single word was spoken. Power, after all, is most effective when it does not need to explain itself. Yet there is something uneasy about this transformation. A wall originally meant to protect against unseen threats had become a display of human ambition. Its symbols no longer addressed spirits alone. They addressed people. They spoke of rank, proximity to power, and the delicate balance between reverence and intimidation. Even the details mattered. The number of claws on each dragon, for example, signaled status. Too many would imply imperial authority. Too few would diminish the message. The wall walked a careful line asserting dominance without overstepping cosmic law. This careful calibration reveals how deeply intertwined belief and politics had become. Spiritual symbolism was no longer just protection. It was governance. And yet, time has a way of rearranging intentions. The palace that once stood behind this wall did not survive. Fire, rebellion, and the slow erosion of dynasties erased it almost completely. What remained was the wall itself, standing alone, disconnected from the power it once advertised. In this sense, the wall outlived its function. What was once a declaration of authority became a relic without context. Visitors no longer approached it as subjects. They approached it as observers. The wall still blocked the view, but now it revealed something unintended, the fragility of the power that built it. This reversal raises a subtle question. If a wall is built to project cosmic order, what happens when belief in that order fades? Does the wall lose its meaning, or does it acquire a new one? Some believe these surviving structures become mirrors. They reflect not the intentions of their builders, but the questions of those who encounter them later. Stripped of their original authority, they invite reinterpretation. What was once certainty becomes mystery. The dragons still coil. The colors still shine. But the hierarchy they once enforced no longer governs the world beyond the wall. The symbols remain, but their commands have softened into suggestions. And yet, the wall still stands. It no longer blocks spirits, nor announces imperial dominance. Instead, it does something quieter. It reminds us that walls can change roles over time, that boundaries built for one purpose often end up serving another. Protection becomes projection. Projection becomes memory. Memory becomes enigma. And standing before such a wall, it is hard not to wonder whether the builders anticipated this outcome. Whether they knew that long after their authority dissolved, the barrier would still speak, just not in the language they intended. Perhaps this was always the fate of walls that tried to embody the universe itself. Because when symbols outlast belief, they do not disappear. They wait. Some walls never touched the land at all. They floated, where rivers widened into harbors and seas pressed against cities. Stone was not always the answer. Water ignores walls the way wind ignores doors. It moves, it shifts, it finds gaps. And yet, for nearly 8 centuries, one of the most powerful cities in the world relied on a boundary that did not rise from the earth, but rested upon the surface of the sea. A chain, stretched across the mouth of a harbor. It formed a line so improbable that many invaders doubted it could be real until their ships struck it. Massive iron links, each weighing more than a grown man, connected into a single continuous barrier. Timber pontoons kept it suspended just below the waterline, hidden until the moment of impact. To approach the harbor was to sail toward nothing and, then suddenly, toward certainty. Some believe the true strength of this barrier was never its material. Iron can be broken. Wood can burn. What made the chain effective was reputation. It was spoken of in the same tone as curses and impossible feats. Captains warned one another. Armies hesitated. Entire fleets chose not to test it. Fear did the work before force was ever required. Behind the chain stood a city that understood psychology as well as engineering. The harbor beyond was narrow, enclosed, and lethal. Ships trapped inside could not maneuver easily. And waiting beyond the barrier were vessels armed with a weapon that seemed to defy natural law. Burning substance that clung to water, flesh, and wood alike, refusing to be extinguished. Some say it burned like judgment itself. In this configuration, the chain was not just a wall. It was a trigger. Crossing it meant committing to a space from which escape was unlikely. The boundary transformed water into a trap, and hesitation into survival. For generations, attackers tried to breach it. They rammed it. They cut at it. They attempted to lift it. Most failed. A few succeeded, but only after prolonged struggle, and often at enormous cost. Stories accumulated around the chain the way legends cling to mountain passes and cursed ruins. There were tales of ships dragged over land to bypass it, only to meet destruction on the other side. Tales of warriors who escaped it through impossible feats of balance and momentum. Tales that blurred the line between strategy and myth. Each story reinforced the same idea. The barrier was not meant to be challenged lightly. Even when technology advanced, the chain retained its power. Cannons thundered against it. Siege engines tested it. The iron held. Again and again, it bought time, and time, as always, reshaped history. What makes this wall different from those of stone is the way it interacted with imagination. It was invisible until encountered. There was no looming silhouette on the horizon, No warning tower rising above the landscape. Just open water and then sudden resistance. In this sense, the chain functioned like belief itself. Unseen until tested. Absolute once revealed. Some believe this is why its eventual defeat feels so unsettling. When the chain finally failed, it was not because it broke. It was because it was circumvented. Ships were dragged across hills under cover of darkness, greased logs turning land into a temporary sea. By morning, the harbor that had been sealed for centuries was breached not by force, but by audacity. The wall did not fall, it was ignored. This moment reframes everything that came before it. The chain had done exactly what it was designed to do. It had held. It had delayed. It had shaped decisions and defined limits. But it could not anticipate a refusal to accept those limits altogether. Walls assume participation. They rely on the agreement that boundaries matter. When that agreement dissolves, even the strongest barrier becomes irrelevant. And yet, to call the chain a failure feels inaccurate. For hundreds of years, it worked. It preserved a city long enough to become legend. It turned a harbor into a symbol of invulnerability. It taught generations that not all defenses need to be visible to be effective. Its true power was never in stopping ships, it was in shaping behavior. Which raises a quiet but persistent question. If a wall's greatest strength lies in the fear it inspires, what happens when fear gives way to imagination? When attackers stop asking how to break the barrier and start asking how to bypass the idea of it? Perhaps every wall, no matter how formidable, contains the seed of its own obsolescence. Not because it can be destroyed, but because someone, somewhere, will eventually decide it does not apply. And when that happens, the wall does not vanish. It becomes a lesson. There is a moment in every long-defended city when the question shifts. It is no longer, can this wall be broken? It becomes, what if the wall no longer matters? For centuries, the harbor barrier had shaped every calculation. Attackers measured their strength against it. Defenders measured their survival by it. Entire strategies formed around the assumption that this liner stretched across water to find what was possible. And then, one night, that assumption was abandoned. Some believe the most decisive moments in history are not loud. They do not arrive with the crash of stone or the collapse of towers. They arrive quietly, with a change in perspective. With the realization that the problem is not the obstacle itself, but the way everyone has agreed to approach it. Instead of charging the barrier again, the attackers looked elsewhere. Not at the chain, but at the land behind it. At the hills rising beyond the harbor. At the possibility that the wall's strength was inseparable from the direction it faced. The plan that followed sounded absurd. Ships belong to water. Hills belong to land. The two do not mix. But absurdity has a way of slipping past defenses built on expectation. Under cover of darkness, logs were laid like rails. Animals strained. Men pushed. Hulls groaned as vessels were dragged inch by inch over earth that had never been meant to feel their weight. What had been sea became slope. What had been impossible became labor. By morning, ships floated where no ships had ever floated before. The wall still stood. The chain still held. And yet the city found itself surrounded. This is the moment where walls revealed their deepest limitation. They are designed to resist force, not imagination. For generations, the harbor barrier had worked because everyone believed it was the final answer. That belief shaped behavior on both sides. Defenders trusted it. Attackers respected it. The wall became a rule rather than a structure. Once that rule was broken, the structure became irrelevant. Some believe this is why the fall that followed feels inevitable in hindsight. Not because the defenses were weak, but because the logic sustaining them had expired. The city had prepared for every known method of attack. Every repetition of the past. What it had not prepared for was a refusal to repeat. Walls are backward-looking by nature. They are built in response to what has already happened. They protect against yesterday's threats. But when tomorrow arrives disguised as novelty, stone and iron struggle to adapt. This does not diminish the power of the barrier. In fact, it emphasizes it. For centuries, it delayed conquest. It shaped empires. It altered the course of trade and war. It did exactly what it was meant to do. But no wall is designed to outlast imagination forever. The city that fell did not fall because its walls failed. It fell because its enemies stopped treating the walls as the center of the problem. They stopped asking how to overcome the barrier, and instead asked how to render it irrelevant. In that sense, the defeat was conceptual before it was physical. Afterward, the great chain was cut apart. Pieces were stored, displayed, reduced to artifacts. What had once been a living boundary became a collection of objects heavy, impressive, but silent. The fear it inspired faded as distance grew between the present and the moment of its power. Yet the lesson lingered. Walls are strongest when they define reality, when they shape what people believe is possible. Once that belief cracks, the wall's material strength matters less than we expect. This realization reframes every barrier discussed so far. The mountain wall that sealed the narrow corridor worked because it convinced generations that chaos belonged on the other side. The spirit walls worked because they trained people to respect thresholds they could not see. The dragon wall worked because it projected cosmic order so convincingly that authority felt natural. And the harbor chain worked because it made attackers hesitate. In every case, belief did the heaviest lifting, which leads to an uncomfortable thought. If walls rely on shared assumptions, then their failure may begin long before the first stone shifts or the first link breaks. It may begin in the mind when someone quietly decides that the rules no longer apply. This is not a story about the weakness of walls. It is a story about their dependence on participation. A wall cannot enforce itself. It cannot adapt. It cannot persuade. It can only stand and wait for others to accept its presence as meaningful. When that acceptance erodes, even the most formidable barrier becomes a backdrop rather than a boundary. And perhaps this is why the most haunting walls are not those that were destroyed, but those that still stand perfectly intact. Long after the world they were built to regulate has moved on, they remain silent witnesses to the moment when certainty gave way to invention. And they ask a question no wall can answer. What happens when the next threat does not arrive where the wall is looking? High above the world most walls were built to regulate. There is a doorway that does not open. It stands carved directly into a cliff face on a windswept plateau, where the air thins and the horizon feels unnervingly close. There are no stairs leading up to it. No road approaching it. No ruins of a settlement gathered nearby. Just a smooth, deliberate shape cut into solid stone atoll frame. A recessed niche, proportions unmistakably intentional. And behind it, nothing. Some believe this is where the logic of walls finally breaks. Because walls are meant to divide spaces. They separate here from there, inside from outside, before from after. Even symbolic walls assume the existence of two sides. But this structure offers only one. A threshold without a destination. A gate that refuses to explain itself. Legends say it was never meant to be used in the way walls usually are. Local traditions speak of priests and shamans who approached the doorway carrying sacred objects, discs of gold said to contain the essence of divine power. At the moment of alignment, the stories say, the stone would respond. Light would fill the recess. The boundary would open, not into another room, but into another state of being. Those who stepped through did not return. Some say they passed into an underworld. Others believe they entered a celestial realm. A few whispered that the doorway was a passage between dimensions, activated by knowledge long forgotten. The variations differ, but the structure of the myth remains consistent. This was not a wall meant to keep something out. It was a wall meant to be crossed. That inversion makes it uniquely unsettling. Unlike the barriers discussed before, built to block, redirect, intimidate, or delay, this doorway suggests invitation. Not for everyone, not casually, but for those who understood how to approach it. Its purpose was not exclusion, but transition. Yet there is no visible mechanism, no hinge, no seal, no mark of use. Archaeologists have found no tools nearby, no debris from construction, no signs of habitation. The stone shows precision, but not context, and context is everything. Without it, interpretation drifts. Some believe the doorway is symbolic, a ritual focal point, where the act of crossing was imagined, rather than enacted. Others argue it was an unfinished project, abandoned before its true function was realized. Still others suggest it served as an altar, a stage for ceremonies meant to simulate passage rather than accomplish it. But none of these explanations fully resolve the unease. Because people who visit the site today report experiences that feel personal rather than theatrical. Dizziness, pressure, vivid dreams following the visit, sensations of vibration when standing within the niche. These accounts vary, but their persistence fuels speculation. The structure seems to provoke response. From a conventional perspective, this could be explained psychologically. High altitude, isolation, acceptational, powerful influences on perception. But belief does not need to be literal to be effective. If a place is approached as a threshold, it often behaves like one. This brings us back to the nature of walls themselves. Perhaps the most profound boundaries are not those that stop movement, but those that frame it, that tell us this is the place where something changes. Whether that change is physical, emotional, or symbolic, may matter less than the shared agreement that the change is real. In this sense, the doorway functions like the spirit walls discussed earlier, but inverted. Instead of blocking unseen forces from entering the human world, it marks a point where humans might leave it. A controlled exit. Some believe ancient cultures were deeply aware of liminal spaces, places that exist between definitions. Caves, mountaintops, shorelines, and doorways all appear repeatedly in myth as sites of transformation. This structure combines several of these elements into one. Stone, height, threshold. Unlike city walls or harbor chains, it was never meant to endure assault or resist pressure. Its strength lay in suggestion, in the quiet insistence that the world does not end at the limits of what we can see. And this may explain why it remains so difficult to categorize. There is no enemy associated with it. No historical battle. No record of conquest or defense. It does not protect a population or assert dominance. It does not even clearly belong to a known architectural tradition. It exists outside the usual motivations for building walls, which makes it dangerous in a different way. Walls that defend can be understood. Walls that project power can be decoded. But a wall that invites crossing without explaining the destination forces us to confront uncertainty without armor. Perhaps that is why the doorway feels unfinished. Not because it was abandoned, but because it was never meant to be completed. Its purpose may have been fulfilled the moment it framed the idea of passage itself. A reminder that not all boundaries are meant to be permanent. Some are meant to be questioned, and some are meant to be approached carefully. Not because they stop us, but because they ask whether we are prepared to leave what we know behind. There are walls that dominate memory, and others that vanish so completely they seem to erase themselves. For centuries, this one belonged to the second category. It did not appear in heroic epics or religious scripture. No chronicler described its construction. No emperor left an inscription claiming credit. Travelers passed nearby without realizing what lay beneath their feet. Farmers quarried its bricks and reused them, unaware they were dismantling one of the largest ancient structures ever built. The wall was not forgotten because it was small. It was forgotten because it was silent. Stretching across a vast plain between sea and mountains, this barrier once traced a hard red line across the landscape. Fired bricks, uniform in size and color, formed a continuous spine that disappeared into the horizon. It was engineered, standardized, and supported by infrastructure on a scale usually associated with imperial capitals, not frontiers. And yet, no one wrote about it. Only when modern technology looked down from above did the shape reveal itself. Satellite images showed a faint but unmistakable scar straight, where nature prefers curves. Deliberate where erosion favors chaos. Archaeologists followed the line on the ground and found the remains of canals, kilns, and forts, spaced with mechanical precision. This was not a wall that grew organically over centuries. It was planned. Some believe its construction represented a moment of extraordinary urgency. To the north lay open steppe, home to mobile groups, who left little trace in the archaeological record, but enormous impact in history. They moved quickly, struck without warning, and disappeared just as fast. Traditional fortifications were ineffective against them, so a line was drawn. Unlike earlier walls that responded to local threats, this one appears to have been conceived as a system from the beginning. Water channels fed brick kilns along its length, turning raw earth into hardened blocks at industrial speed. The same water filled a defensive ditch running parallel to the wall, doubling its effectiveness. Forts housed thousands of soldiers whose task was not conquest, but endurance. Hold the line. What makes this wall unsettling is not just its scale, but its absence from narrative memory. Empires usually announce their achievements. They carve victories into stone, stamp their authority onto coins, and ensure future generations know who built what and why. Here, there is nothing. No declarations, no dates, no names. Some believe this silence was intentional, that the wall was built in a moment of crisis, when survival mattered more than legacy. Others suggest the state that constructed it collapsed so thoroughly that its records vanished with it, leaving only the infrastructure behind. There is also another possibility, that the wall's purpose was so tightly bound to fear that it was never meant to be celebrated. If this barrier truly marked a final line against relentless pressure from the north, then acknowledging it publicly may have felt like admitting vulnerability. Better to let the wall work quietly. Better to let its presence speak only to those stationed upon it. Over time, the threat it faced shifted. New powers emerged from other directions. Trade routes changed. The frontier lost its urgency. The soldiers left. The canals silted up. Without maintenance, the wall softened back into the earth. And history moved on. But local traditions did not forget entirely. Stories persisted of a red serpent stretching across the land, of a barrier built to stop something ancient and dangerous. Some even linked it to older legends of sealed gates and apocalyptic forces, suggesting this, not the more famous walls elsewhere, was the true boundary spoken of in prophecy. Whether this connection is symbolic or literal remains unclear. What is clear is that the wall challenges a basic assumption that the most important structures are the ones most remembered. Here is a case where scale and significance did not guarantee survival in collective memory. The wall did its job and then disappeared, taking its meaning with it. In this sense, it may be the most honest wall of all. It did not seek reverence. It did not inspire myth in its own time. It existed to draw a line and hold it, nothing more. When it was no longer needed, it faded. And yet, standing before its remains today, the questions return. Who decided where this line should be drawn? What knowledge went into its design? And what was considered so threatening that an entire landscape had to be reshaped to keep it out? The wall does not answer. It simply reminds us that history is not only written by those who conquer, but also by those who prepare quietly for the worst and leave behind no explanation when the danger passes. When these walls are placed side by side across continents, cultures, and centuries, a pattern begins to emerge. They were not all built for the same enemy. Some faced armies. Others faced spirits. One faced the sea. Another faced nothing at all. Their materials differ, their technologies vary, and their builders spoke different languages and worshipped different gods. And yet, they all draw lines, not just on land, but in thought. Each wall marks a point where certainty ends and imagination begins. A place where humans decided that whatever lay beyond was too dangerous, too sacred, or too unknowable to be left unmanaged. In this sense, walls are less about geography and more about psychology. They appear most often at thresholds, narrow corridors between mountains and water, gateways between public and private space, harbors where land dissolves into sea, high plateaus where earth meets sky. These are not random locations. They are places where movement concentrates, where transition becomes unavoidable. And transition, by its nature, creates anxiety. What enters might not leave. What leaves might not return unchanged. Walls promise control over that uncertainty. Some believe this is why the earliest walls were not fortresses, but markers. Stones stacked to say, this far, and no further. Over time, those markers thickened, hardened, and accumulated meaning. What began as practical decisions became moral ones. To cross a boundary was no longer just a physical act. It became a violation. This shift is subtle, but profound. Once a boundary is moralized, it no longer needs constant enforcement. People internalize it. They adjust behavior before reaching it. The wall's power moves inward, into expectation and fear. This is visible in every example so far. The mountain wall worked because it framed chaos as something external. The spirit walls worked because they trained people to respect invisible limits. The dragon wall worked because it aligned authority with cosmic order. The harbor chain worked because it made captains hesitate before acting. The silent frontier wall worked because it existed whether or not anyone spoke of it. In each case, the wall succeeded by shaping belief. And belief is remarkably efficient. It requires no maintenance crews, no armies, no replacement stones. Once established, it reproduces itself through story, habit, and assumption. People begin to behave as though the boundary is natural, even inevitable. But belief is also fragile. It depends on shared agreement. The moment that agreement fractures, the wall's power weakens, not because the structure collapses, but because its meaning does. This is where the most unsettling realization surfaces. Walls are never neutral. They encode judgments about what belongs and what does not. They define who is inside the circle of protection and who remains beyond it. Over time, these distinctions harden into identity. Civilization becomes something you are within, rather than something you practice. The wall turns difference into distance. This is not always intentional. Often, it is simply the byproduct of trying to survive. But once established, the effect is the same. The unknown becomes the other. The other becomes the threat. And threats, once named, justify almost anything. Some believe this is why stories of sealed gates and imprisoned forces persist even when the historical details fade. The specifics matter less than the function. The story teaches where to place fear. It gives shape to anxiety that might otherwise turn inward. In this way, walls protect not just against invasion, but against doubt. They reassure those within that order is stable, that danger has a location, and that chaos can be kept at a distance. Whether this is true becomes secondary to whether it feels true. But walls also create blind spots. By focusing attention outward, they can prevent societies from recognizing threats that emerge internally. Economic collapse, political decay, environmental strain, these do not arrive on horseback or by ship. They pass through gates unnoticed because they do not look like enemies. The wall remains pointed in the wrong direction. History shows this pattern again and again. Civilizations invest immense resources into boundaries meant to stop external forces, while neglecting the conditions that undermine them from within. When collapse comes, it often bypasses the wall entirely, not with force, with irrelevance. This does not mean walls are mistakes. It means they are tools, powerful ones, but limited. They solve certain problems extremely well, and others not at all. Understanding this distinction may be the difference between resilience and complacency. Seen this way, the unexplained walls of the ancient world stop being anomalies. They become expressions of a universal impulse, the desire to draw a line where understanding ends. To say, here is where we stop asking questions and start defending answers. And perhaps that is why these structures still unsettle us. Because even now, long after their builders are gone, they invite the same reflection. Where do we draw our lines today? And what do we believe those lines are protecting us from? As the last of these walls recedes into memory, something quieter takes its place. A stillness. Not the silence of abandonment, but the kind that follows understanding. When the urgency to explain fades, and what remains is recognition, rather than conclusion. Because after examining stone barriers stretched across land, floating iron drawn across water, ceremonial screens meant to confuse spirits, and doorways carved into cliffs that lead nowhere at all, one truth becomes difficult to ignore. These walls were never built only to keep something out. They were built to hold something in. Fear, hope, order, meaning. Each wall gathered the anxieties of its time and gave them shape. The fear of invasion became masonry. The fear of unseen forces became ritual barriers. The fear of losing authority became symbolic display. The fear of chaos became a line drawn across the earth. In this way, walls became containers. They allowed societies to locate their uncertainty somewhere specific on the other side of stone, beyond a gate, past a chain, behind a sealed doorway. By doing so, they made the world feel manageable, finite, divided into spaces that could be controlled, and spaces that could be avoided. Some believe this is why the most enduring walls are not the ones that stopped the most enemies, but the ones that organized belief most effectively. Long after their military relevance faded, their psychological imprint remained. Even now, when we encounter these structures, we rarely ask only how they were built. We ask why. And beneath that question lies another. What were their builders afraid of? The answers are rarely simple. They are layered, contradictory, and deeply human. They speak of societies that understood their own fragility, even as they tried to deny it. Of cultures that sensed the limits of control and responded by drawing lines, hoping that lines, once drawn, would hold. But walls do not solve uncertainty. They manage it. And management is temporary. In the end, every barrier becomes either obsolete, symbolic, or invisible. The threats change. The stories evolve. The line that once felt absolute becomes negotiably irrelevant, yet the instinct to draw it never disappears. Perhaps that is the final mystery these ancient walls leave us with. Not what they were keeping out. Not whether the legends were true. Not even whether the walls succeeded or failed. But why? Across time and culture, humanity keeps returning to the same solution. When faced with the unknown, we build a boundary. And when that boundary begins to fade, we search for another place to draw the line. The walls remain, scattered across the world, weathered and incomplete. They no longer guard what they once did. But they still ask something of us quietly, without demand. What are we trying to protect now? And what, without realizing it, are we still holding inside?